A bullet is forged, inspected, boxed and shipped. It's sent to the battlefield. It's loaded into a magazine and sent flying down a trajectory. And then it kills. The world produces roughly 1.4 billion bullets and 550 million guns. 1 in every 12 people has a gun. Behind every bullet is a cold corpse. And for arms dealer Yuri, all he had to do was,
how do we arm the other 11?
This is a true story. Yuri was once a waiter in his own restaurant and ended up being the biggest arms dealer in the world. This movie was the pinnacle of Cage's career. Since then, he's been on the road indefinitely. In the 1950s, there were wars of all sizes all over the world. Yuri was still working in his restaurant. Business was slow and he was poor. Until a chance encounter. He witnessed a gang war. He was scared out of his wits. The gunfire lasted only a moment, and then the bodies were right in front of him. Yuri stared at the shell casings on the ground in disbelief. He smelled an opportunity in the bullets. At that moment he realized, this is a necessity of life. The world is full of conflicts. Conflicts between people. Conflicts between nations. Between countries. And this conflict is often fueled by a need for violence. And that's arms. It's a lot more profitable than running a restaurant. And that's how Yuri started his career in arms. And then Yuri started to learn about guns and sold a gun. He felt that this is what he wanted to do. He found his brother and convinced him to sell arms. At first, he didn't have any contacts. He tried to get the big gunsman to show him the ropes, but he didn't want to see him. He didn't want to see him at all. If you don't have the contacts, then do it yourself. Soon things took a turn for the worse. In 1984, at the end of the civil war in Lebanon, after the American troops withdrew, left behind a large number of used guns. They were piled up like scrap metal. Yuri took them all over, selling them by the pound. He bribed officials. He sold them to local gangs with multiple passports. Yuri sold guns all over the world. It didn't matter who they were, as long as they were willing to pay. They were good business friends. And that's how Yuri's guns, like Coca-Cola, they could circle the globe 10 times over. What's the other guy doing with the guns? Who's he at war with? He's not interested. The only thing he's interested in is money. He doesn't care about morality. He's all about trade. He can sell to peacemakers. He can sell to terrorists. Sometimes he even sells to both sides of a war. There are several steps to marrying a popular celebrity. The first step is to have a top-of-the-line luxury car. The second step is to have a private jet. The third step is to get married. This is Yuri's 3-step program for chasing girls. Of course, the prerequisite for all this is money. And Yuri made more money than he could ever spend. Yuri made more money than he could spend in a couple of lifetimes. Warmth is like lust. Yuri began to think about his life. When he saw May on the billboard, he decided to marry her. Then he began his 3-part quest for a woman. He bought a plane and a house. It wasn't long before Yuri and May got married. After marriage, Yuri stopped for a while, but one's desires can never be filled. Soon Yuri took his brother on a deal. They traveled a long way to their destination, but they didn't want to pay. They wanted to use drugs as collateral. For the sake of their lives, they had to go home with the drugs in frustration. After that bad deal, the brother became addicted to drugs. Yuri was the one who put his brother on this path in the first place. Now he was responsible for it. Yuri had no choice but to send his brother to rehab. He was on his own. He married a star and had a son. The brother is still in rehab. Yuri's savings are starting to get stretched thin. He had to find a way to do something big. That's when the Cold War ended, which meant that their weapons would be left unchecked for a while. Yuri's chance came again. He contacted his uncle, an army officer, at a very low price. This time, it wasn't just long guns. There were tens of thousands of military tanks, thousands of combat helicopters. Just as he and his uncle were discussing how to make money, big trouble began to ensue. First, there was the raid by Officer Jack, but Yuri had his men unload the weapons from the helicopters to disguise it as a regular helicopter, even though the weapons were sitting in a clearing 10 meters away. But it had a qualification document on it. Jack had no choice but to return, but Yuri's uncle was tragically killed. Yuri's uncle was killed by a fellow shooter. For Yuri, arms were just a trade. He didn't want to, and couldn't, get involved in an arms duel. But a businessman like him, who travels every day in the war, he was already in the middle of it. Then he took his business to Africa. At that time, Africa was always at war and in chaos. It was a paradise for arms dealers and a hell on earth. Men to the President of Liberia. The man introduces a magnum pistol to the President of Liberia. The President looks at the soldier next to him. Suddenly, Yuri is terrified, but he can't show it here, and so...
No, you're gonna have to buy it. It's a used gun. How can I sell a used gun?
That's Yuri's wit and guts. A deal was made, and the soldier's body was dragged off. No one took it seriously. That day Yuri was stopped by the Interpol on his way to deliver a shipment. He's been on the radar for a long time. Yuri didn't dare land at the airport, or he'd be caught on the ground. So he forced the pilot to make a forced landing, in order to destroy the evidence before Interpol arrived. Yuri handed out a plane full of weapons to the locals.
Free sample. Tell your brands.
In no time at all, people were coming in droves. It's like a supermarket sale. People with RPGs. Some people are carrying grenades. Others are lugging boxes of weapons to their homes. Yuri looks like one of those shoppers. He's got a yellow van full of merchandise, and he's shouting, "Don't forget the bullets." An hour later, the police arrived, but there was nothing in the plane. Jack had no choice but to let him go again. The next day, the President of Liberia helped him find his informant. He was Yuri's rival. The President slipped a pistol into Yuri's hand. Then he took Yuri's hand and slowly pulled the trigger. He forced Yuri to shoot him. It was Yuri's first kill. That night he went to a bar and got drunk. He was wandering the streets of Liberia. In a trance, he saw a dead snitch, and a little girl holding up her severed hand.
My hand go back.
Suddenly he thought of his own children. He seemed to have found his conscience. He cried like a child. He gave up selling arms. He went into business. But it's easy to get in, but it's hard to get out. There's always someone who'll force you to do it. The President of Liberia came to him, pulled out a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg. He put it in Yuri's hand. Without Yuri's arms support, his regime will be shaken. He needs the king of war back. The blood in his body was boiling. After a fierce battle of ideas, Yuri decided to go back to his old ways. So he and the Liberian president hit it off. A new round of business was about to begin. On her side, May chose to work with Jack. Yuri took his brother, who was out of rehab. Yuri took his brother out of rehab and set foot in Africa again. During the transaction, Yuri's brother saw a mother and son being hacked to death. He persuaded his brother to give up the deal, but Yuri never cared. The brother couldn't contain his guilt. He used a grenade to destroy a truckload of munitions. The guards shot him dead. With one less load of weapons, Yuri only got half the diamonds. The brother was dead. Yuri bribed a doctor. Yuri bribed a doctor to remove the bullet from his body and fake a death certificate. But when he went through security, a bullet was still missing from his brother's body. That's how Jack arrested Yuri. By now, Xiaomei had already left with their children. Her parents had agreed that their two sons had died in Africa. Yuri was left alone and facing prosecution. But so what? In the interrogation room, Yuri told Jack, "Your superiors will soon ask you to release me." Jack, of course, didn't believe it. Yuri said that the reason I was arrested, that's why I'm not guilty, pointing to the newspaper.
And while the biggest arms dealer in the world is your boss, the President of the United States, who ships more merchandise in a day than I do in a year, sometimes it's embarrassing to have his fingerprints on the guns.
In the end, Yuri was acquitted. Guns and ammo in the movie, military tanks and helicopter gunships, are all real. From the point of view of an arms dealer, it looks like a business. It's about a war. From Yuri's point of view, we see under fire, cold, gold-digging arms dealers, and brutal rulers, and ordinary people struggling to survive. Finally, I wish the world would be free of war.